Welcome to 30-Minute Reviews. I am Adam. I'm here to talk about some news that has happened recently. Dishonesty has been permeating and really become kind of not, I want to say it's become the forefront. I just want to say that there's been like two stories really that have the same dishonest feel to them. And I feel like it's important to note that this is happening. So the first of these things is looking at, this is the first one that broke. It is the Oscars categories for best original, best sheer moment, and best best most popular movie, or whatever the fuck it was, that were won by Army of the Dead, and The Flash using the Speed Force to go back in time in Justice League for sheer moment, and then, Army of the Dead for movie. Now, this happens at the Oscars, and the big announcement comes, and it's like, oh, alright, who'd have thunk it that, the Snyder Cut fan base would go out of their way to make this be their big, their big push, and they would turn this into a big rallying point for their, for their, their people to kind of, push the Snyderverse movement, restore the Snyderverse movement into the forefront. Which really, look, here's the thing about restore the Snyderverse. It's like the Snyderverse has been restored because the Snyderverse never went anywhere. Like, everything that has happened so far in, DC has been mostly designed around whatever Zack Snyder kind of did. Like, we have the casting of Gal Gadot as Wonder Woman because of Zack Snyder, and Wonder Woman 3 is happening. As well as things that are tangentially related to that. Shazam is tangentially related via, Henry Cavill's Superman. Even if his face isn't shown, we still see the suit that is Henry Cavill's Superman. The Flash movie that's coming, while it is going to retcon out Ben Affleck, or not retcon out, but it's going to replace Ben Affleck, it is one of those things where it's like, the decision there is not screw Zack Snyder and screw Zack Snyder's legacy there. It's, Ben Affleck doesn't want to do this anymore. If Ben Affleck doesn't want to be Batman anymore, we can't force him to be Batman forever, so if they don't want to do it anymore, then we're going to do it. Aquaman, the casting of Amber Heard, the continued casting of Amber Heard at this point is entirely because of, the heads of DC deciding that that's a good decision for whatever reason. While the initial casting was Zack Snyder, as was the casting of Jason Momoa. So the Snyderverse hasn't gone anywhere. And then in the Backroom movie, the Commissioner Gordon in the Backroom movie is J.K. Simmons, who was reprising from Justice League. And it's one of those things where it's like, would it have made more sense for the Batgirl of that universe to have Jeffrey Wright as her father? Probably, considering it's Leslie Grace, who's not white like J.K. Simmons is. But it's one of those things where we look at this, and we're looking at this whole situation, and the Snyderverse hasn't gone anywhere. So the restore to Snyderverse really just means let Zack Snyder have $200 million to make Justice League 2. So that was their big rallying cry there. Then came the introduction of the new issue, where now the ratings came out for Justice League. And according to HBO Max, 2.2 million people watched the Snyder Cut, Zack Snyder's Justice League. For frame of reference, that is slightly less than the number of people who watched the first episode of... That is slightly more than the number of people who watched the first episode of Batwoman, which I believe was 1.8 million. not including people who watched it on HBO Max after. So the Snyder Cut is slightly more popular than, than Batwoman. So, looking broadly at, all of that, 2.2 million people do that, and it was not as many people watched that as watched Spider-Man, or watched, what was the other one? Like, Cinderella was also in contention for that award. Cinderella was the number 3, I think, movie to win that, and even West Side Story had more viewers on streaming after the fact than, theatrically. If a movie made $10 million in its opening weekend, that would be about, divided in half, 500,000 in its opening weekend, if a movie ticket is $20, and that's piss poor math, but that's 500,000 people who saw that. Now, assuming that all 2.2 million people who watched that movie thought it was the best movie of the year, that would put it at 2.2 million votes. Which, okay, it could have gotten that. But I don't think that every person who watched Zack Snyder's Justice League thought it was the best movie of the year. Now, you're going to be heavily skewed towards yes, it was, because you're going to have a lot of people who are going to be like, fuck a 4-hour cut of Justice League. Like, why am I going to watch a 4-hour cut of Justice League? Who's going to care about that? Besides people who, are already in the tank for it. So, you're going to skew it that way, but at the same time, I don't think it's 100% who liked it like that. Then came the issue that the analytics of when the votes came in and how the votes came in. Where, on average, about 4,000 people a day were voting for each of the top candidates for best, popular movie and all of that, whatever that dumbass category was called, and the Flash one. They're getting about 4,000 votes a day per candidate, give or take, because, there were front runners and all of that. So, looking at that, that's okay, that's the number of people who actually give a fuck about voting for the Academy Awards, who isn't actively in the Academy. So, think of it like that, where it's like, all things considered, that's kind of, that's kind of where it was going. Then came the news. The Hollywood Reporter and Deadline reported that Cinderella was the front runner, which Cinderella winning that award would have been kind of fitting, because that's the thing that people like to look the other way about in fandom, is the impact of women. And we look at the impact of women in fandom, and it's easy to it's very easily dismissed. So the idea that Cinderella was a front runner would have been a huge, huge moment for women-led, projects and all of that. And it's like, oh, so we're looking at this and we're doing all of that, and we're acknowledging that women do have staying power and a large role here in that. And I think that was kind of a catalyst for this movie, because that's the thing too. What was the first panel at Hall H to have lines around and people unable to get in to get seats at Hall H? What was the first panel to do that? Okay, I'm going to qualify it real quick, because I'm not 100% certain if it was qualified when I heard the statistic the first time. But I'm going to qualify it and then correct if I'm wrong. The first panel about a movie to sell out Hall H, it was Twilight. And that's the thing. It's like we're looking at this in a very weird light, where it's like, that doesn't count, this doesn't count, but it's high fantasy. At the end of the day, you may not like the books, you may not like the paranormal romance, but at the end of the day, it's fantasy. The same way Harry Potter is fantasy. The same way that, I did not think I'd be taking a turn to defend Twilight on this. But in that regard, looking at this broadly in that way, it is important to note that women do have a role. And then after that, there was no real change in the trend, except that Zack Snyder's Justice League and that moment from Zack Snyder's Justice League. So it started generating 25,000 votes a day. 25,000 votes a day were coming in for those two movies, which was not in line with anything. So, was it just that they thought that there are two explanations for this? Number one, the idea could be that they thought that no one else would care enough to do it, not understanding the power of Camila Cabello's fan base, which underestimating female-led fan bases is kind of common, unfortunately, where, it's an underserved market for a reason, because people will look at individual failures and then assign it to all and be like, well, that failed, so all of them will fail. Meanwhile, it's like, that's why Catwoman happens, and then it's almost a decade until another female-led superhero movie happens. So, the idea that, or it's over a decade, it was 2003 to 2016 was when Wonder Woman came out. So, looking at it that way, and being like, oh, that could be one thing too, where it's like it was underestimated, and then they decided to ramp it into high gear to make sure it was winning. Or it could have been, we don't want Cinderella to win, because I would say it's probably more that they underestimated how many people would care, because I feel like if the front runner was No Way Home, the same thing would have happened, maybe to a lesser degree, with the bot accounts voting, because 25,000 a day is a lot. And the methodology is pretty interesting in how they did it. So it's one of those things where it's like it is the epitome of they're trying to grassroots a movement, but it's transparently done, and I think that's part of what happened here, and why it's kind of a shitty thing to do. Because look, will those categories get taken back? Who gives a fuck, really? At the end of the day, they're meaningless categories. Who genuinely gives a shit about who won most popular movie and who won most best cheer moment? Especially when best cheer moment had to call back moments from had to call back moments from years past, even decades past, just to kind of pad out the category. When they could have done moments that happened in movies this year. And there are other moments that would fit better that were in the last decade. And it was done specifically to appease the fan base of Zack Snyder. Because they announced initially the most popular movie category, and Zack Snyder's Justice League was not in contention. Because Zack Snyder's Justice League did not come out in theaters, and it was not a movie that was in competition for Academy Awards, because it was not... It didn't hit the entry criteria to be in consideration. It had Emmy consideration, and for whatever reason, they're not interested in pursuing that. But it was not in contention for Academy Awards. So it could not win Most Popular Movie, because one of the criteria is it has to be in contention for... It has to be in competition for an Academy Award. Not in competition in so much as it has to have been nominated, but it had to have been a movie that would have been able to have been nominated, even if it didn't get any nominations on its own. So that is kind of part of what the problem here is that, so then that happens, and then there's a little bit of outcry, like, oh, well, why isn't Zack Snyder's Justice League in contention? It's because of Marvel shills and all this conspiracy theory bullshit. So, are they going to give back the honorary Oscars? Probably not, because I don't think anyone cares enough to be like, we have to take these back. So at the end of the day, nothing's going to change. There's nothing different that's going to happen as a result, and this category's going to be back next year with the same bullshit happening, where it's like, oh, we're going to throw up and the thing is, the most telling thing will be if they do Best Cheer Moment again, because if they don't, and I don't think they can, do Best Cheer Moment again, because of how far-reaching it was, where it's like, going back to, they had to reach back to, like The Matrix, to find moments to nominate. And it's like, if that's what you have to do, then you're not exactly in the situation that you should be with the category. So at that point, it's like you basically gave them a participation Oscar. Now, the second thing that we're looking at here is this. This is a video game story more than a movie story. Well, I mean, it's not at all a movie story. So, during the early days of the pandemic, there was this sudden rush to get things appraised. Like, to go to send in your trading cards, to send in your comics, to send in your video games, to get them graded, to have their value set and slabbed so that they can be resold. And, you know, it gets graded by these companies that do the grading and all of that. And more recently, video games has become part of that market. Old video games are now just as valuable as old comics and old trading cards in terms of grading. So then comes the big thing of, video games. This is now happening with video games. They're being graded. And this company, I think it's Waco or something similar to that. I really should have written it down before I started talking about this. But this company goes out and does this, and they're auctioning off these games that are graded at 10, and they're graded at, all of this stuff. And arguably this is substantially more important than the Snyder Cut getting its participation trophies. But they're doing this, and they go out, and it's like a graded 10 Super Mario, sealed, all of that, is going for $150,000. And it's like, oh, holy shit, old video games have value, and now they're being graded, and you can do that gives them more value. Because I think that one of the things that really, here's the thing about this, is that when you have games being graded, and we have financial ties saying this is how much this is worth at the top end, so like, here's the thing, okay? If I tell you the most expensive car, or you know what? Let's use food as an example. So, I'm selling bananas, okay? And I have a banana, and the banana is worth however much the banana is. If I want to inflate the price of the banana, I take a banana from my set, say this banana is perfect, and this perfect banana is worth $60. So now we scale everything according to how much is the most valuable one worth. The most valuable video game, in this case, is the Super Mario game, that was going for $150,000. So because of that, everything else scaled up in value. Every other game scales up in value, regardless if it's graded or not. Because it's like, well, if the most expensive one is going for this, then logically this other stuff should be going for more too. So, looking at it that way, and being like, so this is impacting this entire market, is I've talked about the used game and the old game market being as important as it is to everything in video games, because the used game market is the only way a good amount of games can still be played for the historical longevity of it. In the same way that, like, we don't have this problem with books, we don't have this problem with movies, we don't have this problem with music. If there's something, as long as there is a recording, we can listen to the recording. As long as there is a record somewhere of that recording, we can listen to it. And as long as there is a book, it can be transcribed and read medium to medium. As long as there is some recording of the movie, we can watch it over and over and over again. Now, there is this problem where there were some things in the past that weren't properly archived, so there are some blind spots in cinema history. But the problem was we discovered this way later. And we discovered this during the time video games were starting to make their appearance. And the problem becomes, this belief that, oh, this is not what this is. So if you want to go back and play an old game, you need to find the old game, because not all of them were ported over, especially considering licensing and all of these other things that become part of it. it needed to be addressed in some way. So now what's happening is, by inflating the prices of these games artificially, number one, the entire point of doing that was because the guy who was running the auction thing was also on the board of directors of the grading company, which, as the grading company was doing that, he was getting the money from the grading company because they were getting more customers because of all of this. So it is this kind of weird situation. Not weird situation, it's a fraudulent situation, as described by the article I read. But if this is happening, and this is what's going on, it has the potential to completely throw out of whack this market and completely fuck up, local game stores who their bread and butter is selling old games, who they got a pretty big boost when this happened. In the same way that, they announced that Battlefront 2 for the Xbox was going to be going to Xbox One. And because it was going to be going to Xbox One, it suddenly became a lot more valuable and a lot more expensive. So these local game stores are able to increase the price on it because there's a very limited supply of these of copies of Battlefront 2, and they have the control of the supply. So if they can, they're going to be like, okay, well, we're going to increase the price, and then you can, and then we'll charge more than we would have charged because, someone who is looking to play it on the Xbox would pay $8 for it. But now that you can plug it into your current one, it is now more valuable. So I think that that's the bigger problem here, is that it's like this guy's personal enrichment scheme did have reverberating efforts, and now that it's come out and that's the case, this is going to have a reverse reverberating effort where these people who have gone out and have been able to capitalize on the increased value of the market are going to essentially be screwed, where they're going to have to take lower margins because they're going to have to decrease the price now if it turns out that all of this is true, and it turns out that the valuation is actually substantially lower than it is. Because if the most expensive game is not worth $150,000, it's only worth, $50,000, then that's a substantial cut to have to take, because then everything goes down. The entire market is impacted by one person who decided to attempt to cheat the system. One person ruined it for everyone, hurt it for everyone. And it's a shame. It is one of those things where it's like, he has done so much damage with one action. Because not just to the businesses who are going to be impacted, not just to the people who got scammed, not just to the people who, in his business who are going to be facing the impact of this, where should, the state of California take action, it could dissolve the company, it could do any number of things if the company was being fraudulent out of the gate. There are a lot of things that, are potentially that are potentially going to happen immediately there, but then also, the impact that happens if video game stores can't keep up with the new rates as game prices go down. If they do go down, I don't think they will, because prices don't typically deflate for finite stock items. So, like in this case, you don't typically see prices go down for something that is of a finite stock. So basically, think of it like this: they're not making any more copies of Pokemon Emerald unless you buy a bootleg copy, and it's just the ROM saved to a Game Boy Advance cartridge that's not official. There's no new copies of Emerald being made by Nintendo or the Pokemon Company or whoever manufactures the Game Boy Advance games. They're not making those anymore. So while that's while the value may be decreased, I don't think it's going to have a substantial impact. But I think that where we are now, it is untenable for someone who's trying to get in, and not get into selling, but get into the history of games, and get into games of the past. It is now harder. The barrier of entry has been raised in this one very meaningful way. Especially for a genre where so many games are defined by past games. So many genres of video game are dependent on you knowing the history of video games. Like, if I say to you, what is a roguelike? Well, what does that mean? It's like when we talk about movies, we'll say noir. We won't, which is, a noir is a detective story that's dark, and it's got a morally ambiguous protagonist and all of that. So noir works. It's something that is, there. And even so, that's kind of something that's kind of seeped in the history of the medium, but it goes beyond that into books and other things. It's like a comedy is a comedy. A drama is a drama. Science fiction is science fiction. Animation is animation. You can tell, and it's easy to differentiate. Some of the more subtle ones are, like noir, or the romantic comedy, or those kind of genres are maybe they're a little bit harder to track. Maybe they're a little different when you're looking at them, over the course of over the course of that. But either way, it is a little bit easier. Now, if I say something's a roguelike, or a Souls-like, it is dependent on that person who is reading about this new game to know what Rogue is. And I think Rogue's biggest legacy is that it was the first dungeon crawler. When a name like Dungeon Crawler exists, which tells you everything you need to know about what type of game it is, the existence of roguelike as an explanation feels like a gatekeeping mechanism, in the same way that saying a game is a Metroidvania. Like, both Castlevania and Metroid have changed so drastically since they were initially released that calling a game a Metroidvania means absolutely nothing. Besides, it is, and the thing is, too, it's like it is a 2D side-scrolling game with a basically open world that unlocks further as you get more power-ups. That's what the game is. And it's defined by its gameplay mechanics. And the fact that we're using other games as benchmarks for, like, oh, that's what this is, it does make it harder to get in, especially when these older games are not as especially easy to pick up and find. So it is one of those things where it's like it does need to be defined a little bit clearer. Like, I don't know. It is just one of those things where it's like, it does need to be clearly, mentioned that it is, I don't know. This whole thing does have a substantial cost to it beyond just the initial fraud. And that is worth exploring further. And I think it is much more important than, the cheating of, the Snyder fan base to win a participation trophy, and also ran. So, you know what? I think we've covered a lot today. We've done a good half hour, and I think that we've made a lot of progress towards, towards telling what needs to happen, and all of that. And I think that broadly we need to stop referring to games, to game genres by by their like what other games they're like. I think even using 4X as a term to define a Civilization style game, which is real-time strategy. I feel like that's not a helpful kind of thing either. So yeah, it's one of those things where it's like I feel like there are better ways to do these things, but as a whole, the community isn't going to change, so we got off track. But if you are someone who bought a graded copy of a video game for a exorbitant amount of money, I do have a certain amount of sympathy for you, and the amount of sympathy scales with the amount of money that you spent on a single piece of sports memorabilia, because it's like when that guy spent 150, had spent like $500,000 on Tom Brady's last touchdown football, and then he came out of retirement the next week, and it's like, okay, cool, like, but at the same time, it's like, oh, feel bad for this guy, and it's like, well, why the fuck should I feel bad for this guy? He's got the disposable income to spend $500,000 on a single piece of sports memorabilia. Come the fuck on. I don't feel bad for him. Like, it's the same thing here. If you bought one and it was cheap, you know, maybe I'll feel worse for you than the guy who spent a lot of money and was conned. Because, you know, you fucked up. So we'll wrap up there for today, and we'll be back with more news as it happens. So until then, have a great rest of your week.